Are you afraid of vampires? Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, unable to move your body, but aware that someone or something was hiding in the darkness, biding its time, waiting to drain the very life force from your body? You know, vampires, more than almost any other product of the darkness of human imagination, are inexorably connected with our own sexual desires. There's also the belief that the legend of the vampire may have originated in porphyria and anemia, blood disorders that could cause its sufferers to seek out certain external sources of iron and hemoglobin. Whatever the case, it's hard to argue with the popularity of vampires. Dracula, for instance, holds the record for being portrayed in 538 films, far more than any other literary character. But are we really afraid of vampires? Just the simple concept of a demonic presence that can feed on us and turn us into an undead monstrosity obsessed with nothing but bloodlust? Well, that's up to you. But for the writers of these three early public domain stories, the possible existence of vampires was very much something to fear, not revel in. And then there's Ray Bradbury, who, in a not at all public domain story, describes a revel of vampires and the loneliness of the human boy who, because he is mortal, cannot partake in it. So turn down those lights, grab a glass of your favorite red, and let's get this party started, shall we? The Tomb of Sarah by F.G. Loring, 1900. My father was the head of a celebrated firm of church restorers and decorators about 60 years ago. He took a keen interest in his work and made an especial study of any old legends or family histories that came under his observation. He was necessarily very well read and thoroughly well posted in all questions of folklore and medieval legend. As he kept a careful record of every case he investigated, the manuscripts he left at his death have a special interest. From amongst them, I have selected the following as being a particularly weird and extraordinary experience. In presenting it to the public, I feel it is superfluous to apologize for its supernatural character. My father's diary, 1841, June 17th. Received a commission from my old friend Peter Grant to enlarge and restore the chancel of his church at Hagerstone in the wilds of the West Country. July 5th. Went down to Hagerstone with my head man Summers, a very long and tiring journey. July 7th. Got the work well started. The old church is one of special interest to the antiquarian, and I shall endeavor while restoring it to alter the existing arrangements as little as possible. One large tomb, however, must be moved bodily 10 feet at least to the southward. Curiously enough, there is a somewhat forbidding inscription upon it in Latin, and I am sorry that this particular tomb should have to be moved. It stands amongst the graves of the Kenyans, an old family which has been extinct in these parts for centuries. The inscription on it runs thus: Sarah, 1630. For the sake of the dead and the welfare of the living, let this sepulchre remain untouched and its occupant undisturbed till the coming of Christ, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. July 8th. Took counsel with Grant concerning the Sarah tomb. We are both very loath to disturb it, but the ground is sunk so beneath it that the safety of the church is in danger. Thus, we have no choice. However, the work shall be done as reverently as possible under our own direction. Grant says there is a legend in the neighborhood that it is the tomb of the last of the Kenyans, the evil Countess Sarah, who was murdered in 1630. She lived quite alone in the old castle, whose ruins still stand 3 miles from here on the road to Bristol. Her reputation was an evil one even for those days. She was a witch or werewoman, the only companion of her solitude being a familiar in the shape of a huge Asiatic wolf. This creature was reputed to seize upon children, or failing these, sheep and other small animals, and convey them to the castle, where the Countess used to suck their blood. It was popularly supposed that she could never be killed. This, however, proved a fallacy, since she was strangled one day by a mad peasant woman who lost 2 children, she declaring that they had both been seized and carried off by the Countess's familiar. This is a very interesting story, since it points to a local superstition very similar to that of the vampire, existing in Slavonic and Hungarian Europe. The tomb is built of black marble, surmounted by an enormous slab of the same material. On the slab is a magnificent group of figures. A young and handsome woman reclines upon a couch. Round her neck is a piece of rope, the end of which she holds in her hand. At her side is a gigantic dog with bared fangs and lolling tongue. The face of the reclining figure is a cruel one. The corners of the mouth are curiously lifted, showing the sharp points of long canine or dog teeth. The whole group, though magnificently executed, leaves a most unpleasant sensation. If we move the tomb, it will have to be done in 2 pieces, the covering slab first, and then the tomb proper. We have decided to remove the covering slab tomorrow. July 9th, 6 p.m. A very strange day. By noon, everything was ready for lifting off the covering stone, and after the men's dinner, we started the jacks and pulleys. The slab lifted easily enough, though it fitted closely into its seat and was further secured by some sort of mortar or putty, which must have kept the interior perfectly airtight. None of us were prepared for the horrible rush of foul, moldy air that escaped as the cover lifted clear of its seating. And the contents that gradually came into view were more startling still. There lay the fully dressed body of a woman, wizened and shrunk and ghastly pale as if from starvation. Round her neck was a loose cord and, judging by the scars still visible, the story of death of strangulation was true enough. The most horrible part, however, was the extraordinary freshness of the body. Except for the appearance of starvation, life might have been only just extinct. The flesh was soft and white, the eyes were wide open and seemed to stare at us with a fearful understanding in them. The body itself lay on mold, without any pretense to coffin or shell. For several moments we gazed with horrible curiosity, and then it became too much for my workmen, who implored us to replace the covering slab. That, of course, we would not do, but I set the carpenters to work at once to make a temporary cover while we moved the tomb to its new position. This is a long job and will take 2 or 3 days at least. July 9th, 9 p.m. Just at sunset, we were startled by the howling of, seemingly, every dog in the village. It lasted for 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour, and then ceased as suddenly as it began. This, and a curious mist that had risen round the church, makes me feel rather anxious about the Sarah tomb. According to the best established traditions of the vampire-hunted countries, the disturbance of dogs or wolves at sunset is supposed to indicate the presence of one of these fiends, and local fog is always considered to be a certain sign. The vampire has the power of producing it for the purpose of concealing its movements near its hiding place at any time. I dare not mention or even hint my fears to the rector, for he is, not unnaturally perhaps, a rank disbeliever in many things that I know, from experience, are not only possible, but even probable. I must work this out alone at first, and get his aid without his knowing in what direction he is helping me. I shall now watch till midnight at least. 10:15 p.m. As I feared and half expected, just before 10 there was another outburst of the hideous howling. It was commenced most distinctly by a particularly horrible and blood-curdling wail from the vicinity of the churchyard. The chorus lasted only a few minutes, however, and at the end of it I saw a large dark shape, like a huge dog, emerge from the fog and lope away at a rapid canter toward the open country. Assuming this to be what I fear, I shall see it return soon after midnight. 12:30 p.m. I was right. Almost as midnight struck, I saw the beast returning. It stopped at the spot where the fog seemed to commence, and lifting up its head, gave tongue to that particularly horrible, long-drawn wail that I had noticed as preceding the outburst earlier in the evening. Tomorrow I shall tell the rector what I have seen, and if, as I expect, we hear of some neighboring sheepfold having been raided, I shall get him to watch with me for this nocturnal marauder. I shall also examine the Sarah tomb for something which he may notice without any previous hint from me. July 10th. I found the workmen this morning much disturbed in mind about the howling of the dogs. "We don't like it, sir," one of them said to me. "We don't like it. There was something abroad last night that was unholy." They were still more uncomfortable when the news came round that a large dog had made a raid upon a flock of sheep, scattering them far and wide, and leaving 3 of them dead with torn throats in the field. When I told the rector of what I had seen and what was being said in the village, he immediately decided that we must try and catch, or at least identify, the beast I had seen. "Of course," said he, "it is some dog lately imported into the neighborhood, for I know of nothing about here nearly as large as the animal you describe, though its size may be due to the deceptive moonlight. This afternoon I asked the rector, as a favor, to assist me in lifting the temporary cover that was on the tomb, giving as an excuse the reason that I wished to obtain a portion of the curious mortar with which it had been sealed. After a slight demur he consented, and we raised the lid. If the sight that met our eyes gave me a shock, at least it appalled Grant. "Great God!" he exclaimed. "The woman is alive!" And so it seemed for a moment. The corpse had lost much of its starved appearance and looked hideously fresh and alive. It was still wrinkled and shrunken, but the lips were firm and of the rich red hue of health. The eyes, if possible, were more appalling than ever, as though fixed and staring. At one corner of the mouth I thought I noticed a slight, dark-colored froth, but I said nothing about it then. "Take your piece of mortar, Harry," gasped Grant, "and let us shut the tomb again. God help me. Parson though I am, such dead faces frighten me." Nor was I sorry to hide that terrible face again, but I got my bit of mortar, and I have advanced a step toward the solution of the mystery. This afternoon the tomb was moved several feet toward its new position, but it will be 2 or 3 days yet before we shall be ready to replace the slab. 10:15 p.m. Again, the same howling at sunset, the same fog enveloping the church, and at 10 o'clock the same great beast slipping silently out into the open country. I must get the rector's help and watch for its return, but precautions we must take, for if things are as I believe, we take our lives in our hands when we venture out into the night to waylay the vampire. Why not admit it at once? For that the beast I have seen is the vampire of that evil thing in the tomb I can have no reasonable doubt. Not yet come to its full strength, thank heaven. After the starvation of nearly 2 centuries, for at present it can only maraud as a wolf apparently, but in a day or two, when full power returns, That dreadful woman in new strength and beauty will be able to leave her refuge. Then it would not be sheep merely that would satisfy her disgusting lust for blood, but victims that would yield their lifeblood without a murmur to her caressing touch. Victims that, dying of her foul embrace, themselves must become vampires in their turn to prey on others. Mercifully, my knowledge gives me a safeguard, for that little piece of mortar that I rescued today from the tomb contains a portion of the sacred host, and who holds it, humbly and firmly believing in its virtue, may pass safely through such an ordeal as I intend to submit myself and the rector to tonight. 12:30 a.m. Our adventure is over for the present, and we are back safe. After writing the last entry recorded above, I went off to find Grant and tell him that the marauder was out on the prowl again. "But Grant," I said, "before we start out tonight, I must insist that you will let me prosecute this affair in my own way. You must promise to put yourself completely under my orders, without asking any questions as to the why and wherefore." After a little demur and some excusable chafe on his part at the serious view I was taking of what he called a dog hunt, he gave me his promise. I then told him that we were to watch tonight and try and track the mysterious beast, but not to interfere with it in any way. I think, in spite of his jests, that I impressed him with the fact that there might be, after all, good reason for my precautions. It was just after 11 when we stepped out into the still night. Our first move was to try and penetrate the dense fog round the church, but there was something so chilly about it, and a faint smell so disgustingly rank and loathsome, that neither our nerves nor our stomachs were proof against it. Instead, we stationed ourselves in the dark shadow of a yew tree that commanded a good view of the wicket entrance to the churchyard. At midnight, the howling of the dogs began again, and in a few minutes we saw a large gray shape, with green eyes shining like lamps, shamble swiftly down the path towards us. The rector started forward, but I laid a firm hand upon his arm and whispered a warning, "Remember." Then we both stood very still and watched as the great beast cantered swiftly by. It was real enough, for we could hear the clicking of its nails on the stone flags. It passed within a few yards of us, and seemed to be nothing more nor less than a great gray wolf, thin and gaunt, with bristling hair and dripping jaws. It stopped where the mist commenced, and turned round. It was truly a horrible sight, and made one's blood run cold. The eyes burnt like fires, the upper lip was snarling and raised, showing the great canine teeth, while round the mouth clung and dripped a dark-colored froth. It raised its head and gave tongue to its long, wailing howl, which was answered from afar by the village dogs. After standing for a few moments, it turned and disappeared into the thickest part of the fog. Very shortly afterwards, the atmosphere began to clear, and within 10 minutes the mist was all gone, the dogs in the village were silent, and the night seemed to reassume its normal aspect. We examined the spot where the beast had been standing and found, plainly enough upon the stone flags, dark spots of froth and saliva. "Well, Rector," I said, "will you admit now, in the view of things you have seen today, in consideration of the legend, the woman in the tomb, the fog, the howling dogs, and, last but not least, the mysterious beast you have seen so close, that there is something not quite normal in it all? Will you put yourself unreservedly in my hands and help me, whatever I may do, to first make assurance doubly sure, and finally take the necessary steps for putting an end to this horror of the night?" I saw that the uncanny influence of the night was strong upon him, and wished to impress it as much as possible. "Needs must," he replied. "When the devil drives, and in the face of what I have seen, I must believe that some unholy forces are at work. Yet, how can they work in the sacred precincts of a church? Shall we not call rather upon heaven to assist us in our need? Grant, I said solemnly, that we must do, each in his own way. God helps those who help themselves, and by his help and the light of my knowledge, we must fight this battle for him and the poor lost soul within. We then returned to the rectory and to our rooms, though I have sat up to write this account while the scene is fresh in my mind. July 11th. Found the workmen again very much disturbed in their minds and full of a strange dog that had been seen during the night by several people who had hunted it. Farmer Stotman, who had been watching his sheep, the same flock that had been raided the night before, had surprised it over a fresh carcass and tried to drive it off, but its size and fierceness so alarmed him that he had beaten a hasty retreat for a gun. When he returned, the animal was gone, though he found that 3 more sheep from his flock were dead and torn. The Sarah tomb was moved today to its new position, but it was a long, heavy business, and there was not time to replace the covering slab. For this I was glad, as in the prosaic light of day the rector almost disbelieves the events of the night, and is prepared to think everything to have been magnified and distorted by our imagination. As, however, I could not possibly proceed with my war of extermination against this foul thing without assistance, and as there is nobody else I can rely upon, I appealed to him for one more night, to convince him that it was no delusion, but a ghastly, horrible truth, which must be fought and conquered for our own sakes, as well as that of all the living in the neighborhood. Put yourself in my hands, Rector, I said, for tonight at least. Let us take those precautions which my study of the subject tells me are the right ones. Tonight you and I must watch in the church, and I feel assured that tomorrow you will be as convinced as I am, and be equally prepared to take those awful steps which I know to be proper. And I must warn you that we shall find a more startling change in the body lying there than you noticed yesterday. My words came true, for on raising the wooden cover once more, the rank stench of a slaughterhouse arose, making us feel positively sick. There lay the vampire, but how changed from the starved and shrunken corpse we saw 2 days ago for the first time. The wrinkles had almost disappeared, the flesh was firm and full, the crimson lips grinned horribly over the long, pointed teeth. A distinct smear of blood had trickled down one corner of the mouth. We set our teeth, however, and hardened our hearts. Then we replaced the cover and put what we had collected into a safe place in the vestry. Yet even now Grant could not believe that there was any real or pressing danger concealed in that awful tomb, as he raised strenuous objections to any apparent desecration of the body without further proof. This he shall have tonight. God grant that I am not taking too much on myself. If there is any truth in old legends, it would be easy enough to destroy the vampire now, but Grant will not have it. I hope for the best of this night's work, but the danger in waiting is very great. 6 p.m. I have prepared everything, the sharp knives, the pointed steak, fresh garlic, and the wild dog roses. All these I have taken and concealed in the vestry, where we can get at them when our solemn vigil commences. If either or both of us die with our fearful task undone, let those reading my records see that this is done. I lay it upon them as a solemn obligation, that the vampire be pierced through the heart with the stake. Then let the burial service be read over the poor clay at last released from its doom. Thus shall the vampire cease to be, and a lost soul rest. July 12th. All is over. After the most terrible night of watching and horror, one vampire, at least, will trouble the world no more. But how thankful should we be to a merciful providence that the awful tomb was not disturbed by anyone not having the knowledge necessary to deal with its dreadful occupant. I write this with no feelings of self-complacency, but simply with a great gratitude for the years of study I have been able to devote to this special subject. And now to my tale. Just before sunset last night, the rector and I locked ourselves into the church and took up our positions in the pulpit. It was one of those pulpits to be found in some churches, which is entered from the vestry, the preacher appearing at a good height through an arched opening in the wall. This gave us a sense of security which we felt we needed, a good view of the interior, and direct access to the implements which I had concealed in the vestry. The sun set and the twilight gradually deepened and faded. There was, so far, no sign of the usual fog, nor any howling of the dogs. At 9 o'clock the moon rose, and her pale light gradually flooded the aisles, and still no sign of any kind from the Sarah tomb. The rector had asked me several times what he might expect, but I was determined that no words or thought of mine should influence him, and that he should be convinced by his own senses alone. By 10:30 we were both getting very tired, and I began to think that perhaps, after all, we should see nothing that night. However, soon after 11 we observed a light mist rising from the Sarah tomb. It seemed to scintillate and sparkle as it rose, and curled in a sort of pillar or spiral. I said nothing, but I heard the rector give a sort of gasp as he clutched my arm feverishly. "Great heaven," he whispered, "it is taking shape." And true enough, in a very few moments we saw standing erect by the tomb the ghastly figure of the Countess Sarah. She looked thin and haggard still, and her face was deadly white, but the crimson lips looked like a hideous gash in the pale cheeks, and her eyes glared like red coals in the gloom of the church. It was a fearful thing to watch as she stepped unsteadily down the aisle, staggering a little as if from weakness and exhaustion. This was perhaps natural, as her body must have suffered much physically from her long incarceration, in spite of the unholy forces which kept it fresh and well. We watched her to the door and wondered what would happen, but it appeared to present no difficulty, for she melted through it and disappeared. "Now, Grant," I said, "do you believe?" "Yes," he replied, "I must. Everything is in your hands, and I will obey your commands to the letter if you can only instruct me how to rid my poor people of this unnameable terror." "By God's help I will," said I, "but you shall be yet more convinced first, for we have a terrible work to do, and much to answer for in the future, before we leave the church again this morning. And now to work, for in its present weak state the vampire will not wander far, but may return at any time, and must not find us unprepared." We stepped down from the pulpit and, taking dog roses and garlic from the vestry, proceeded to the tomb. I arrived first, and, throwing off the wooden cover, cried, "Look, it is empty!" There was nothing there, nothing except the impress of the body in the loose, damp mold. I took the flowers and laid them in a circle round the tomb, for legend teaches us that vampires will not pass over these particular blossoms if they can avoid it. Then, 8 or 10 feet away, I made a circle on the stone pavement, large enough for the rector and myself to stand in, and within the circle I placed the implements that I had brought into the church with me. "Now," I said, "from this circle, which nothing unholy can step across, you shall see the vampire face to face, and see her afraid to cross that other circle of garlic and dog roses to regain her unholy refuge. But on no account step beyond the holy place you stand in, for the vampire has a fearful strength not her own, and, like a snake, can draw her victim willingly to his own destruction." Now, so far my work was done, and, calling the rector, we stepped into the holy circle to await the vampire's return. Nor was this long delayed. Presently a damp, cold odor seemed to pervade the church, which made our hair bristle and flesh to creep. And then, Down the aisle with noiseless feet came that which we watched for. I heard the rector mutter a prayer, and I held him tightly by the arm, for he was shivering violently. Long before we could distinguish the features, we saw the glowing eyes and the crimson, sensual mouth. She went straight to her tomb, but stopped short when she encountered my flowers. She walked right round the tomb, seeking a place to enter, and as she walked, she saw us. A spasm of diabolical hate and fury passed over her face, but it quickly vanished, and a smile of love, more devilish still, took its place. She stretched out her arms toward us. Then we saw that her mouth gathered a bloody froth, and from under her lips long pointed teeth gleamed and champed. She spoke, a soft, soothing voice, a voice that carried a spell with it and affected us both strangely, particularly the rector. I wished to test as far as possible, without endangering our lives, the vampire's power. Her voice had a soporific effect, which I resisted easily enough, but which seemed to throw the rector into a sort of trance. More than this, it seemed to compel him to her in spite of his efforts to resist. "Come," she said, "come. I give sleep and peace, sleep and peace, sleep and peace." She advanced a little towards us, but not far, for I noted that the sacred circle seemed to keep her back like an iron hand. My companion seemed to become demoralized and spellbound. He tried to step forward and, finding me detain him, whispered, "Harry, let go. I must go. She is calling me. I must. Oh, help me, help me." And he began to struggle. It was time to finish. "Grant," I cried in a loud, firm voice, "in the name of all that you hold sacred, have done and play the man." He shuddered violently and gasped, "Where am I?" Then he remembered and clung to me convulsively for a moment. At this, a look of damnable hate changed the smiling face before us, and with a sort of shriek she staggered back. "Back," I cried, "back to your unholy tomb. No longer shall you molest the suffering world. Your end is near." It was fear that now showed itself in her beautiful face, for it was beautiful in spite of its horror, as she shrank back and over the circlet of flowers, shivering as she did so. At last, with a low, mournful cry, she appeared to melt back again into her tomb. And as she did so, the first gleams of the rising sun lit up the world, and I knew all danger was over for the day. Taking Grant by the arm, I drew him with me out of the circle and led him to the tomb. There lay the vampire once more, still in her living death, as we had a moment before seen her in her devilish life. But in the eyes remained that awful expression of hate and cringing, appalling fear. Grant was pulling himself together. "Now," I said, "will you dare the last terrible act and rid the world forever of this horror?" "By God," he said solemnly, "I will. Tell me what to do." "Help me to lift her out of the tomb. She can harm us no more," I replied. With averted faces we set to our terrible task and laid her out upon the flags. "Now," I said, "read the burial service over the poor body, and then let us give it its release from this living hell that holds it." Reverently, the rector read the beautiful words, and reverently I made the necessary responses. When it was over, I took the stake and, without giving myself time to think, plunged it with all my strength through the heart. As though really alive, the body for a moment writhed and kicked convulsively, and an awful, heart-rending shriek woke the silent church. Then all was still. Then we lifted the poor body back, and, thank God, The consolation that legend tells is never denied to those who have to do such awful work as ours came at last. Over the face stole a great and solemn peace. The lips lost their crimson hue, the prominent sharp teeth sank back into the mouth, and for a moment we saw before us the calm, pale face of a most beautiful woman who smiled as she slept. A few minutes more, and she faded away to dust before our eyes as we watched. We set to cleaning up every trace of our work, and then departed for the rectory. Most thankful were we to step out of the church, with its horrible associations, into the rosy warmth of the summer morning. With the above ends the notes in my father's diary, though a few days later this further entry occurs. July 15th. Since the 12th, everything has been quiet and as usual. We replaced and sealed up the Sarah tomb this morning. The workmen were surprised to find the body had disappeared, but took it to be the natural result of exposing it to the air. One odd thing came to my ears today. It appears that the child of one of the villagers strayed from home the night of the 11th, and was found asleep in a coppice near the church, very pale and quite exhausted. There were 2 small marks on her throat, which have since disappeared. What does this mean? I have, however, kept it to myself, as, now that the vampire is no more, no further danger either to that child or any other is to be apprehended. It is only those who die of the vampire's embrace that become vampires at death in their turn. The Room in the Tower by E.F. Benson, 1912. It is probable that everybody who is at all a constant dreamer has had at least one experience of an event or a sequence of circumstances which have come to mind in sleep being subsequently realized in the material world. But, in my opinion, so far from this being a strange thing, it would be far odder if this fulfillment did not occasionally happen, since our dreams are, as a rule, concerned with people whom we know and places with which we are familiar, such as might very naturally occur in the awake and daylit world. True, these dreams are often broken into by some absurd and fantastic incident, which puts them out of court in regard to their subsequent fulfillment, but on the mere calculation of chances, it does not appear in the least unlikely that a dream imagined by anyone who dreams constantly should occasionally come true. Not long ago, for instance, I experienced such a fulfillment of a dream, which seems to me in no way remarkable, and to have no kind of psychical significance. The manner of it was as follows. A certain friend of mine, living abroad, is amiable enough to write to me about once in a fortnight. Thus, when 14 days or thereabouts have elapsed since I have last heard from him, my mind, probably, either consciously or subconsciously, is expectant of a letter from him. One night last week, I dreamed that as I was going upstairs to dress for dinner, I heard, as I often heard, the sound of the postman's knock on my front door, and diverted my direction downstairs instead. There, among other correspondence, was a letter from him. Thereafter the fantastic entered, for on opening it I found inside the ace of diamonds, and scribbled across it in his well-known handwriting, "I am sending you this for safe custody, as you know it is running an unreasonable risk to keep aces in Italy." The next evening I was just preparing to go upstairs to dress when I heard the postman's knock, and did precisely as I had done in my dream. There, among other letters, was one from my friend, only it did not contain the ace of diamonds. Had it done so, I should have attached more weight to the matter, which, as it stands, seems to me a perfectly ordinary coincidence. No doubt I consciously or subconsciously expected a letter from him, and this suggested to me my dream. Similarly, the fact that my friend had not written to me for a fortnight suggested to him that he should do so. But occasionally it is not so easy to find such an explanation, and for the following story I can find no explanation at all. It came out of the dark, and into the dark it has gone again. All my life, I have been a habitual dreamer. The nights are few, that is to say, when I do not find on awaking in the morning that some mental experience has been mine, and sometimes, all night long, apparently, a series of the most dazzling adventures befall me. Almost without exception, these adventures are pleasant, though often merely trivial. It is of an exception that I am going to speak. It was when I was about 16 that a certain dream first came to me, and this is how it befell. It opened with my being set down at the door of a big red brick house where, I understand, I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was being served in the garden, and led me through a low, dark-paneled hall with a large open fireplace onto a cheerful green lawn set round with flower beds. There were grouped around the tea table a small party of people, but they were all strangers to me except one, who was a schoolfellow called Jack Stone, clearly the son of the house, and he introduced me to his mother and father and a couple of sisters. I was, I remember, somewhat astonished to find myself here, for the boy in question was scarcely known to me, and I rather disliked what I knew of him. Moreover, he had left school nearly a year before. The afternoon was very hot, and an intolerable oppression reigned. On the far side of the lawn ran a red-bricked wall with an iron gate in its center, outside which stood a walnut tree. We sat in the shadow of the house opposite a row of long windows, inside which I could see a table with cloth laid, glimmering with glass and silver. This garden front of the house was very long, and at one end of it stood a tower of 3 stories, which looked to me much older than the rest of the building. Before long, Mrs. Stone, who, like the rest of the party, had sat in absolute silence, said to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Quite inexplicably, my heart sank at her words. I felt as if I had known that I should have the room in the tower, and that it contained something dreadful and significant. Jack instantly got up, and I understood that I had to follow him. In silence, we passed through the hall, and mounted a great oak staircase with many corners, and arrived at a small landing with 2 doors set in it. He pushed one of these open for me to enter, and without coming in himself, closed it after me. Then I knew that my conjecture had been right. There was something awful in the room, and with the terror of nightmare growing swiftly and enveloping me, I awoke in a spasm of terror. Now, that dream, or variations on it, occurred to me intermittently for 15 years. Most often it came in exactly this form: the arrival, the tea laid out on the lawn, the deadly silence succeeded by that one deadly sentence, the mounting with Jack Stone up to the room in the tower where horror dwelt. And it always came to a close in the nightmare of terror at that which was in the room, though I never saw what it was. At other times I experienced variations on this same theme. Occasionally, for instance, we would be sitting at dinner in the dining room, into the windows of which I had looked on the first night when the dream of this house visited me. But wherever we were, there was the same silence, the same sense of dreadful oppression and foreboding. And the silence, I knew, would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." Upon which, this was invariable, I had to follow him up the dark staircase with many corners, and enter the place that I dreaded more and more each time that I visited it in my sleep. Or, again, I would find myself playing cards still in silence in a drawing room lit with immense chandeliers that gave a blinding illumination. What the game was, I have no idea. What I remember, with a sense of miserable anticipation, was that soon Mrs. Stone would get up and say to me, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." This drawing room where we played cards was next to the dining room, and, as I have said, was always brilliantly illuminated, whereas the rest of the house was full of dusk and shadows. And yet, how often, in spite of those bouquets of light, have I not pored over the cards that were dealt me, scarcely able for some reason to see them. Their designs, too, were strange. There were no red suits, but all were black, and among them were certain cards which were black all over. I hated and dreaded those. As this dream continued to recur, I got to know the greater part of the house. There was a smoking room beyond the drawing room, and at the end of the passage with a green baize door. It was always very dark there, and as often as I went there, I passed somebody whom I could not see in the doorway coming out. Curious developments, too, took place in the characters that peopled the dream, as might happen to living persons. Mrs. Stone, for instance, who, when I first saw her, had been black-haired, became gray, and instead of rising briskly as she had done at first when she said, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower," got up very feebly, as if the strength was leaving her limbs. Jack also grew up, and became a rather ill-looking young man with a brown mustache, while one of the sisters ceased to appear, and I understood she was married. Then it so happened that I was not visited by this dream for 6 months or more, and I began to hope, in such inexplicable dread did I hold it, that it had passed away for good. But one night after this interval, I again found myself being shown out onto the lawn for tea, and Mrs. Stone was not there, while the others were all dressed in black. At once I guessed the reason, and my heart leaped at the thought that perhaps this time I should not have to sleep in the room in the tower, and though we usually all sat in silence, on this occasion the sense of relief made me talk and laugh as I had never yet done. But even then matters were not altogether comfortable, for no one else spoke, but they all looked secretly at each other, and soon the foolish stream of my talk ran dry, and gradually an apprehension worse than anything I had previously known gained on me as the light slowly faded. Suddenly, a voice which I knew well broke the stillness, the voice of Mrs. Stone, saying, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." It seemed to come from near the gate in the red brick wall that bounded the lawn, and looking up, I saw that the grass outside was sown thick with gravestones. A curious, grayish light shone from them, and I could read the lettering on the grave nearest me, and it was, "In evil memory of Julia Stone." And, as usual, Jack got up, and again I followed him through the hall and up the staircase with many corners. On this occasion it was darker than usual, and when I passed into the room in the tower, I could only just see the furniture, the position of which was already familiar to me. Also, there was a dreadful odor of decay in the room, and I woke screaming. The dream, with such variations and developments as I have mentioned, went on at intervals for 15 years. Sometimes I would dream it 2 or 3 nights in succession. Once, as I have said, there was an intermission of 6 months, but taking a reasonable average, I should say that I dreamed it quite as often as once in a month. It had, as is plain, something of nightmare about it, since it always ended in the same appalling terror, which, so far from getting less, seemed to me to gather fresh fear every time I experienced it. There was, too, a strange and dreadful consistency about it. The characters in it, as I have mentioned, got regularly older. Death and marriage visited this silent family, and I never, in the dream, after Mrs. Stone had died, set eyes on her again. But it was always her voice that told me that the room in the tower was prepared for me, and whether we had tea out on the lawn or the scene was laid in one of the rooms overlooking it, I could always see her gravestone standing just outside the iron gate. It was the same, too, with the married daughter. Usually she was not present, but once or twice she returned again in company with a man whom I took to be her husband. He, too, like the rest of them, was always silent, but owing to the constant repetition of the dream, I had ceased to attach, in my waking hours, any significance to it. I never met Jack Stone again during all those years, nor did I ever see a house that resembled this dark house of my dream. And then, something happened. I had been in London in this year, up till the end of the July, and during the first week in August, went down to stay with a friend in a house he had taken for the summer months in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. I left London early, for John Clinton was to meet me at Forest Row Station, and we were going to spend the day golfing and go to his house in the evening. He had his motor with him, and we set off about 5 of the afternoon after a thoroughly delightful day for the drive, the distance being some 10 miles. As it was still so early, we did not have tea at the clubhouse, but waited till we should get home. As we drove, the weather, which up till then had been, though hot, deliciously fresh, seemed to me to alter in quality and become very stagnant and oppressive, and I felt that indefinable sense of ominous apprehension that I am accustomed to before thunder. John, however, did not share my views, attributing my loss of lightness to the fact that I had lost both my matches. Events proved, however, that I was right, though I do not think that the thunderstorm that broke that night was the sole cause of my depression. Our way lay through deep, high-banked lanes, and before we had gone very far I fell asleep, and was only awakened by the stopping of the motor, and with a sudden thrill, partly of fear, but chiefly of curiosity, I found myself standing in the doorway of my house of dream. We went, I half wondering whether or not I was dreaming still, through a low oak-paneled hall and out onto the lawn where tea was laid in the shadow of the house. It was set in flower beds, a red brick wall with a gate in it bounded one side, and out beyond that was a space of rough grass with a walnut tree. The facade of this house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-storied tower markedly older than the rest. Here, for the moment, all resemblance to the repeated dream ceased. There was no silent and somehow terrible family, but a large assembly of exceedingly cheerful persons, all of whom were known to me. And in spite of the horror with which the dream itself had always filled me, I felt nothing of it now that the scene of it was thus reproduced before me. But I felt intensest curiosity as to what was going to happen. Tea pursued its cheerful course, and before long Mrs. Clinton got up, and at that moment I think I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me, and what she said was, "Jack will show you your room. I have given you the room in the tower." At that, for half a second, the horror of the dream took hold of me again. But it quickly passed, and again I felt nothing more than the most intense curiosity. It was not very long before it was amply satisfied. John turned to me. "Right up at the top of the house," he said, "but I think you'll be comfortable. We are absolutely full up. Would you like to go and see it now? By Jove, I believe that you are right, and that we are going to have a thunderstorm. How dark it has become." I got up and followed him. We passed through the hall and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door, and I went in. And at that moment, sheer unreasoning terror again possessed me. I did not know what I feared. I simply feared. Then, like a sudden recollection, when one remembers a name which has long escaped the memory, I knew what I feared. I feared Mrs. Stone, whose grave with the sinister inscription, "In evil memory," I had so often seen in my dream, just beyond the lawn which lay below my window. And then, once more, the fear passed so completely that I wondered what there was to fear, and I found myself, sober and quiet and sane, in the room in the tower, the name of which I had so often heard in my dream, and the scene of which was so familiar. I looked around it with a certain sense of proprietorship, and found that nothing had been changed from the dreaming nights in which I knew it so well. Just to the left of the door was the bed, lengthways along the wall, with the head of it in the angle. In a line with it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Opposite the door, the outer wall was pierced by 2 lattice-paned windows, between which stood the dressing table, while ranged along the 4th wall was the washing stand and a big cupboard. My luggage had already been unpacked, for the furniture of dressing and undressing lay orderly on the washstand and toilet table, while my dinner clothes were spread out on the coverlet of the bed. And then, with a sudden start of unexplained dismay, I saw that there were 2 rather conspicuous objects which I had not seen before in my dreams. One, a life-sized oil painting of Mrs. Stone. The other, a black and white sketch of Jack Stone, representing him as he had appeared to me only a week before in the last of the series of these repeated dreams, a rather secret and evil-looking man of about 30. His picture hung between the windows, looking straight across the room to the other portrait which hung at the side of the bed. At that I looked next, and as I looked, I felt once more the horror of nightmares seize me. It represented Mrs. Stone as I had seen her last in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired. But in spite of the evident feebleness of body, a dreadful exuberance and vitality shone through the envelope of flesh, an exuberance wholly malign, a vitality that foamed and frothed with unimaginable evil. Evil beamed from the narrow, leering eyes. It laughed in the demon-like mouth. The whole face was instinct with some secret and appalling mirth. The hands clasped together on the knee seemed shaking with suppressed and nameless glee. Then I saw also that it was signed in the left-hand bottom corner, and wondering who the artist could be, I looked more closely and read the inscription, "Julia Stone, by Julia Stone." There came a tap at the door, and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," said I, pointing to the picture. He laughed. "Hard-featured old lady," he said. "By herself, too, I remember. Anyhow, she can't have flattered herself much." "But don't you see?" said I. "It's scarcely a human face at all. It's the face of some witch, of some devil." He looked at it more closely. "Yes, it isn't very pleasant," he said. "Scarcely a bedside manner, eh? Yes, I can imagine getting the nightmare if I went to sleep with that close by my bed. I'll have it taken down if you like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant, we detached the picture and carried it out onto the landing and put it with its face to the wall. "By Jove, the old lady is a weight," said John, mopping his forehead. "I wonder if she had something on her mind." The extraordinary weight of the picture had struck me, too. I was about to reply when I caught sight of my own hand. There was blood on it, in considerable quantities, covering the whole palm. "I've cut myself somehow," said I. John gave a little startled exclamation. "Why, I have too," he said. Simultaneously, the footman took out his handkerchief and wiped his hand with it. I saw that there was blood also on his handkerchief. John and I went back into the tower room and washed the blood off, but neither on his hand nor on mine was there the slightest trace of a scratch or cut. It seemed to me that, having ascertained this, we both, by a sort of tacit consent, did not allude to it again. Something in my case had dimly occurred to me that I did not wish to think about. It was but a conjecture, but I fancied that I knew the same thing had occurred to him. The heat and oppression of the air, for the storm we had expected was still undischarged, increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom were John Clinton and myself, sat outside on the path bounding the lawn where we had had tea. The night was absolutely dark, and no twinkle of star or moon ray could penetrate the pall of cloud that overset the sky. By degrees our assembly thinned. The women went up to bed, men dispersed to the smoking or billiard room, and by 11 o'clock my host and I were the only two left. All the evening I thought that he had something on his mind, and as soon as we were alone, he spoke. "The man who helped us with the picture had blood on his hand, too. Did you notice?" he said. I asked him just now if he had cut himself, and he said he supposed he had, but that he could find no mark of it. Now where did that blood come from? By dint of telling myself that I was not going to think about it, I had succeeded in not doing so, and I did not want, especially just at bedtime, to be reminded of it. "I don't know," said I, "and I don't really care so long as the picture of Mrs. Stone is not by my bed." He got up. "But it's odd," he said. "Now you'll see another odd thing." A dog of his, an Irish Terrier by breed, had come out of the house as we talked. The door behind us into the hall was open, and a bright oblong of light shone across the lawn to the iron gate which led on to the rough grass outside where the walnut tree stood. I saw that the dog had all his hackles up, bristling with rage and fright. His lips were curled back from his teeth, as if he were ready to spring at something, and he was growling to himself. He took not the slightest notice of his master or me, but stiffly and tensely walked across the grass to the iron gate. There he stood for a moment, looking through the bars and still growling. Then, of a sudden, his courage seemed to desert him. He gave one long howl and scuttled back to the house with a curious, crouching sort of movement. "He does that half a dozen times a day," said John. "He sees something which he both hates and fears." I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something was moving on the grass outside, and soon a sound which I could not instantly identify came to my ears. Then I remembered what it was. It was the purring of a cat. I lit a match and saw the purrer, a big blue Persian, walking round and round in a little circle just outside the gate, stepping high and ecstatically, with tail carried aloft like a banner. Its eyes were bright and shining, and every now and then it put its head down and sniffed at the grass. I laughed. "The end of that mystery, I am afraid," I said. "Here's a large cat having Walpurgis night all alone." "Yes, that's Darius," said John. "He spends half the day and all night there. But that's not the end of the dog mystery, for Toby and he are the best of friends, but the beginning of the cat mystery. What's the cat doing there? And why is Darius pleased while Toby is terror-stricken? At that moment, I remembered the rather horrible detail of my dreams when I saw through the gate, just where the cat was now, the white tombstone with the sinister inscription. But before I could answer, the rain began, as suddenly and heavily as if a tap had been turned on, and simultaneously the big cat squeezed through the bars of the gate and came leaping across the lawn to the house for shelter. Then it sat in the doorway, looking out eagerly into the dark. It spat and struck at John with its paw as he pushed it in order to close the door. Somehow, with the portrait of Julius Stone in the passage outside, the room in the tower had absolutely no alarm for me, and as I went to bed, feeling very sleepy and heavy, I had nothing more than interest for the curious incident about our bleeding hands and the conduct of the cat and dog. The last thing I looked at before I put out my light was the square, empty space by my bed where the portrait had been. Here, the paper was of its original full tint of dark red. Over the rest of the walls, it had faded. Then, I blew out my candle and instantly fell asleep. My awaking was equally instantaneous, and I sat bolt upright in bed under the impression that some bright light had been flashed in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room which I had dreaded in dreams, but no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after, a peal of thunder crackled just above the house, but the probability that it was only a flash of lightning which awoke me gave no reassurance to my galloping heart. Something, I knew, was in the room with me, and instinctively I put out my right hand, which was nearest the wall, to keep it away, and my hand touched the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter onto the floor. But for the moment there was no need of light, for a blinding flash leaped out of the clouds and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. And instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also, namely a figure that leaned over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mold, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead, the thunder cracked and roared, and when it had ceased and a deathly stillness succeeded, I heard a rustle of movement coming nearer me, and, more horrible yet, perceived an odor of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close beside my ear I heard quick taken, eager breathing. Yet I knew that this thing, though it could be perceived by touch, by smell, by eye, and by ear, was still not of this earth, but something that had passed out of the body and had power to make itself manifest. Then a voice, already familiar to me, spoke. "I knew you would come to the room in the tower," it said. "I have been long waiting for you. At last you have come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together." And the quick breathing came closer to me. I could feel it on my neck. At that, the terror, which I think had paralyzed me for the moment, gave way to the wild instinct of self-preservation. I hit wildly with both arms, kicking out at the same moment, and heard a little animal squeal, and something soft dropped with a thud beside me. I took a couple of steps forward, nearly tripping up over whatever it was that lay there, and by the merest good luck found the handle of the door. In another second, I ran out on the landing and had banged the door behind me. Almost at the same moment, I heard a door open somewhere below, and John Clinton, candle in hand, came running upstairs. "What is it?" he said. "I sleep just below you, and heard a noise as if... Good heavens, there's blood on your shoulder." I stood there, so he told me afterward, swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with the mark on my shoulder, as if a hand covered with blood had been laid there. "It's in there," I said, pointing. "She, you know. The portrait is in there, too, hanging up on the place we took it from." At that, he laughed. "My dear fellow, this is mere nightmare," he said. He pushed by me and opened the door, I standing there simply inert with terror, unable to stop him, unable to move. "Phew, what an awful smell," he said. Then there was silence. He had passed out of my sight behind the open door. Next moment he came out again, as white as myself, and instantly shut it. "Yes, the portrait's there," he said. "And on the floor is a thing spotted with earth, like what they bury people in. Come away, quick, come away." How I got downstairs I hardly know. An awful shuddering and nausea of the spirit rather than of the flesh had seized me, and more than once he had to place my feet upon the steps, while every now and then he cast glances of terror and apprehension up the stairs. But in time we came to his dressing room on the floor below, and there I told him what I have here described. The sequel can be made short. Indeed, some of my readers have perhaps already guessed what it was, if they remember that inexplicable affair of the churchyard at West Folly some 8 years ago, where an attempt was made 3 times to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide. On each occasion, the coffin was found in the course of a few days, again protruding from the ground. After the 3rd attempt, in order that the thing should not be talked about, the body was buried elsewhere in unconsecrated ground. Where it was buried was just outside the iron gate of the garden belonging to the house where this woman had lived. She had committed suicide in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone. Subsequently, the body was again secretly dug up, and the coffin was found to be full of blood. Count Magnus by M.R. James, 1904. By what means the papers out of which I have made a connected story came into my hands is the last point which the reader will learn from these pages. But it is necessary to prefix to my extracts from them a statement of the form in which I possess them. They consist, then, partly of a series of collections for a book of travels, such a volume as was a common product of the 40s and 50s. Horace Marriott's Journal of a Residence in Jutland and the Danish Isles is a fair specimen of the class to which I allude. These books usually treated of some unfamiliar district on the continent. They were illustrated with woodcuts or steel plates. They gave details of hotel accommodation and of means of communication such as we now expect to find in any well-regulated guidebook, and they dealt largely in reported conversations with intelligent foreigners, racy innkeepers, and garrulous peasants. In a word, they were chatty. Begun with the idea of furnishing material for such a book, my papers, as they progressed, assumed the character of a record of one single personal experience, and this record was continued up to the very eve, almost, of its termination. The writer was a Mr. Wraxall. For my knowledge of him, I have to depend entirely on the evidence his writings afford, and from these I deduce that he was a man past middle age, possessed of some private means, and very much alone in the world. He had, it seems, no settled abode in England, but was the denizen of hotels and boarding houses. It is probable that he entertained the idea of settling down at some future time which never came, and I think it also likely that the Pantechnicon fire in the early 70s must have destroyed a great deal that would have thrown light on his antecedents, for he refers once or twice to property of his that was warehoused at that establishment. It is further apparent that Mr. Wraxall had published a book, and that it treated of a holiday he had once taken in Brittany. More than this I cannot say about his work, because a diligent search in bibliographical works has convinced me that it must have appeared either anonymously or under a pseudonym. As to his character, it is not difficult to form some superficial opinion. He must have been an intelligent and cultivated man. It seems that he was near being a fellow of his college at Oxford. His besetting fault was pretty clearly that of over-inquisitiveness, possibly a good fault in a traveler, certainly a fault for which this traveler paid dearly enough in the end. On what proved to be his last expedition, he was plotting another book. Scandinavia, a region not widely known to Englishmen 40 years ago, had struck him as an interesting field. He must have lighted on some old books of Swedish history or memoirs, and the idea had struck him that there was room for a book descriptive of travel in Sweden, interspersed with episodes from the history of some of the great Swedish families. He procured letters of introduction, therefore, to some persons of quality in Sweden, and set out thither in the early summer of 1863. Of his travels in the north there is no need to speak, nor of his residence of some weeks in Stockholm. I need only mention that some savant resident there put him on the track of an important collection of family papers belonging to the proprietors of an ancient manor house in Västergötland, and obtained for him permission to examine them. The manor house, or herrgård, in question is to be called Robak, though that is not its name. It is one of the best buildings of its kind in all the country, and the picture of it in Dahlenberg's Suecia Antiqua et Moderna, engraved in 1694, shows it very much as a tourist may see it today. It was built soon after 1600 and is, roughly speaking, very much like an English house of that period in respect of material, red brick with stone facings and style. The man who built it was a scion of the great house of de la Gardie, and his descendants possess it still. De la Gardie is the name by which I will designate them when mention of them becomes necessary. They received Mr. Wraxall with great kindness and courtesy, and pressed him to stay in the house as long as his researches lasted. But, preferring to be independent and mistrusting his powers of conversing in Swedish, he settled himself at the village inn, which turned out quite sufficiently comfortable, at any rate during the summer months. This arrangement would entail a short walk daily to and from the manor house of something under a mile. The house itself stood in a park and was protected, we should say grown up, with large old timber. Near it you found the walled garden, and then entered a close wood fringing one of the small lakes with which the whole country is pitted. Then came the wall of the domain, and you climbed a steep knoll, a knob of rock lightly covered with soil, and on the top of this stood the church, fenced in with tall, dark trees. It was a curious building to English eyes. The nave and aisles were low, and filled with pews and galleries. In the western gallery stood the handsome old organ, gaily painted, and with silver pipes. The ceiling was flat, and had been adorned by a 17th century artist with a strange and hideous Last Judgment full of lurid flames, falling cities, burning ships, crying souls, and brown and smiling demons. Handsome brass coronae hung from the roof. The pulpit was like a doll's house, covered with little painted wooden cherubs and saints. A stand with 3 hourglasses was hinged to the preacher's desk. Such sights as these may be seen in many a church in Sweden now, but what distinguished this one was an addition to the original building. At the eastern end of the north aisle, the builder of the manor house had erected a mausoleum for himself and his family. It was a largish, 8-sided building, lighted by a series of oval windows, and it had a domed roof, topped by a kind of pumpkin-shaped object rising into a spire, a form in which Swedish architects greatly delighted. The roof was of copper externally, and was painted black, while the walls, in common with those of the church, were staringly white. To this mausoleum there was no access from the church. It had a portal and steps of its own on the northern side. Past the churchyard, the path to the village goes, and not more than 3 or 4 minutes bring you to the inn door. On the first day of his stay at Roebuck, Mr. Wraxall found the church door open, and made those notes of the interior which I have epitomized. Into the mausoleum, however, he could not make his way. He could, by looking through the keyhole, just descry that there were fine marble effigies and sarcophagi of copper, and a wealth of armorial ornament, which made him very anxious to spend some time in investigation. The papers he had come to examine at the manor house proved to be of just the kind he wanted for his book. There were family correspondence, journals, and account books of the earliest owners of the estate, very carefully kept and clearly written, full of amusing and picturesque detail. The first de la Gardie appeared in them as a strong and capable man. Shortly after the building of the mansion, there had been a period of distress in the district, and the peasants had risen and attacked several chateaux and done some damage. The owner of Roebuck took a leading part in suppressing the trouble, and there was reference to executions of ringleaders and severe punishments inflicted with no sparing hand. The portrait of this Magnus de la Gardie was one of the best in the house, and Mr. Wraxall studied it with no little interest after his day's work. He gives no detailed description of it, but I gather that the face impressed him rather by its power than by its beauty or goodness. In fact, he writes that Count Magnus was an almost phenomenally ugly man. On this day, Mr. Wraxall took his supper with the family and walked back in the late but still bright evening. "I must remember," he writes, "to ask the sexton if he can let me into the mausoleum at the church. He evidently has access to it himself, for I saw him tonight standing on the steps and, as I thought, locking or unlocking the door." I find that early on the following day, Mr. Wraxall had some conversation with his landlord. His setting it down at such length as he does surprised me at first, but I soon realized that the papers I was reading were, at least in their beginning, the materials for the book he was meditating, and that it was to have been one of those quasi-journalistic productions which admit of the introduction of an admixture of conversational matter. His object, he says, was to find out whether any traditions of Count Magnus de la Gardie lingered on in the scenes of that gentleman's activity, and whether the popular estimates of him were favorable or not. He found that the Count was decidedly not a favorite. If his tenants came late to their work on the days which they owed to him as lord of the manor, they were set on the wooden horse, or flogged and branded in the manor house yard. 1 or 2 cases there were of men who had occupied lands which encroached on the lord's domain, and whose houses had been mysteriously burnt on a winter's night with the whole family inside. But what seemed to dwell on the innkeeper's mind most, for he returned to the subject more than once, was that the Count had been on the Black Pilgrimage and had brought something or someone back with him. You will naturally inquire, as Mr. Wraxall did, what the Black Pilgrimage may have been, but your curiosity on the point must remain unsatisfied for the time being, just as his did. The landlord was evidently unwilling to give a full answer, or indeed any answer on the point, and, being called out for a moment, trotted off with obvious alacrity, only putting his head in at the door a few minutes afterwards to say that he was called away to Skara and should not be back till evening. So Mr. Wraxall had to go unsatisfied to his day's work at the manor house. The papers on which he was just then engaged soon put his thoughts into another channel, for he had to occupy himself with glancing over the correspondence between Sophia Albertina in Stockholm and her married cousin Ulrica Leonora at Roebuck in the years 1705 to 1710. The letters were of exceptional interest from the light they threw upon the culture of that period in Sweden, as anyone can testify who has read the full edition of them in the publications of the Swedish Historical Manuscripts Commission. In the afternoon he had done with these, and after returning the boxes in which they were kept to their places on the shelf, he proceeded, very naturally, to take down some of the volumes nearest to them in order to determine which of them had best be his principal subject of investigation next day. The shelf he had hit upon was occupied mostly by a collection of account books in the writing of the first Count Magnus. But one among them was not an account book, but a book of alchemical and other tracts in another 16th century hand. Not being very familiar with alchemical literature, Mr. Wraxall spends much space which he might have spared in setting out the names and beginnings of the various treatises: the Book of the Phoenix, Book of the 30 Words, Book of the Toad, Book of Miriam, Turba Philosophorum, and so forth. And then he announces with a good deal of circumstance his delight at finding, on a leaf originally left blank near the middle of the book, some writing of Count Magnus himself, headed Liber Nigri Peregrinationis. It is true that only a few lines were written, but there was quite enough to show that the landlord had that morning been referring to a belief at least as old as the time of Count Magnus, and probably shared by him. This is the English of what was written. If any man desires to obtain a long life, if he would obtain a faithful messenger and see the blood of his enemies, it is necessary that he should first go into the city of Chorazin, and there salute the prince. Here there was an erasure of one line, not very thoroughly done, so that Mr. Wraxall felt pretty sure that he was right in reading it as Ares, or of the air. But there was no more of the text copied, only a line in Latin. See the rest of this matter among the more private things. It could not be denied that this threw a rather lurid light upon the tastes and beliefs of the Count, but to Mr. Wraxall, separated from him by nearly 3 centuries, the thought that he might have added to his general forcefulness and to alchemy something like magic only made him a more picturesque figure, and when, after a rather prolonged contemplation of his picture in the hall, Mr. Wraxall set out on his homeward way, his mind was full of the thought of Count Magnus. He had no eyes for his surrounding, no perception of the evening scents of the woods or the evening light of the lake, and when all of a sudden he pulled up short, he was astonished to find himself already at the gate of the churchyard, and within a few minutes of his dinner. His eyes fell on the mausoleum. "Ah," he said, Count Magnus, there you are. I should dearly like to see you. Like many solitary men, he writes, I have a habit of talking to myself aloud, and, unlike some of the Greek and Latin particles, I do not expect an answer. Certainly, and perhaps fortunately in this case, there was neither voice nor any that regarded. Only the woman who, I suppose, was cleaning up the church dropped some metallic object on the floor whose clang startled me. Count Magnus, I think, sleeps sound enough. That same evening, the landlord of the inn, who had heard Mr. Wraxall say that he wished to see the clerk or deacon, as he would be called in Sweden, of the parish, introduced him to that official in the inn parlor. A visit to the De la Gardie tomb house was soon arranged for the next day, and a little general conversation ensued. Mr. Wraxall, remembering the one function of Scandinavian deacons is to teach candidates for confirmation, thought he would refresh his own memory on a biblical point. "Can you tell me," he said, "anything about Chorazin?" The deacon seemed startled, but readily reminded him how that village had once been denounced. "To be sure," said Mr. Wraxall, "it is, I suppose, quite a ruin now." "So I expect," replied the deacon. "I have heard some of our old priests say that the Antichrist is to be born there, and there are tales—" "Ah, what tales are those?" Mr. Wraxall put in. "Tales, I was going to say, which I have forgotten," said the deacon, and soon after that he said good night. The landlord was now alone, and at Mr. Wraxall's mercy, and that inquirer was not inclined to spare him. "Herr Nielsen," he said, "I have found out something about the Black Pilgrimage. You may as well tell me what you know. What did the Count bring back with him?" Swedes are habitually slow, perhaps, in answering, or perhaps the landlord was an exception, I am not sure, but Mr. Wraxall notes that the landlord spent at least 1 minute in looking at him before he said anything at all. Then he came close up to his guest, and with a good deal of effort he spoke. "Mr. Wraxall, I can tell you this one little tale, and no more. You must not ask anything when I have done. In my grandfather's time, that is, 92 years ago, there were 2 men who said, 'The Count is dead. We do not care for him. We will go tonight and have a free hunt in his wood. The long wood on the hill that you have seen behind Roebuck.' Well, those that heard them say this. They said, 'No, do not go. We are sure that you will meet with persons walking who should not be walking. They should be resting, not walking.' These men laughed. There were no forest men to keep the wood, because no one wished to hunt there. The family were not here at the house. These men could do what they wished. Very well, they go to the wood that night. My grandfather was sitting here in this room. It was the summer, and a light night. With the window opened, he could see out to the wood and hear. So he sat there, and 2 or 3 men with him, and they listened. At first, they hear nothing at all. Then they hear someone. You know how far away it is. They hear someone scream, just as if the most inside part of his soul was twisted out of him. All of them in the room caught hold of each other, and they sat so for 3/4 of an hour. Then they hear someone else, only about 300 ells off. They hear him laugh out loud. It was not one of those 2 men that laughed, and indeed, they have all of them said that it was not any man at all. After that, they hear a great door shut. Then, when it was just light with the sun, they all went to the priest. They said to him, 'Father, put on your gown and your ruff, and come to bury these men, Anders Bjornsson and Hans Thorbjorn. You understand that they were sure these men were dead. So they went to the wood. My grandfather never forgot this. He said they were all like so many dead men themselves. The priest, too, he was in a white fear. He said when they came to him, I heard one cry in the night, and I heard one laugh afterwards. If I cannot forget that, I shall not be able to sleep again. So they went to the wood, and they found these men on the edge of the wood. Hans Thorbjorn was standing with his back against a tree, and all the time he was pushing with his hands, pushing something away from him which was not there. So he was not dead. And they led him away and took him to the house at Nyköping, and he died before the winter. But he went on pushing with his hands. Also, Anders Bjornsson was there, but he was dead. And I tell you this about Anders Bjornsson, that he was once a beautiful man, but now his face was not there, because the flesh of it was sucked away off the bones. You understand that? My grandfather did not forget that. And they laid him on the bier which they had brought, and they put a cloth over his face, and the priest walked before, and they began to sing the psalm for the dead as well as they could. So, as they were singing the end of the first verse, one fell down, and the others looked back, and they saw that the cloth had fallen off, and the eyes of Anders Bjornsson were looking up, because there was nothing to close over them. And this they could not bear. Therefore the priest laid the cloth upon him, and sent for a spade, and they buried him in that place. The next day Mr. Wraxall records that the deacon called for him soon after his breakfast, and took him to the church and mausoleum. He noticed that the key of the latter was hung on a nail just by the pulpit, and it occurred to him that, as the church door seemed to be left unlocked as a rule, it would not be difficult for him to pay a second and more private visit to the monuments if there proved to be more of interest among them than could be digested at first. The building, when he entered it, he found not unimposing. The monuments, mostly large erections of the 17th and 18th centuries, were dignified if luxuriant, and the epitaphs and heraldry were copious. The central space of the domed room was occupied by 3 copper sarcophagi covered with finely engraved ornament. 2 of them had, as is commonly the case in Denmark and Sweden, a large metal crucifix on the lid. The third, that of Count Magnus, as it appeared, had, instead of that, a full-length effigy engraved upon it, and round the edge were several bands of similar ornament representing various scenes. One was a battle with cannon belching out smoke, and walled towns and troops of pikemen. Another showed an execution. In a third, among trees, was a man running at full speed, with flying hair and outstretched hands. After him followed a strange form. It would be hard to say whether the artist had intended it for a man, and was unable to give the requisite similitude, or whether it was intentionally made as monstrous as it looked. In view of the skill with which the rest of the drawing was done, Mr. Wraxall felt inclined to adopt the latter idea. The figure was unduly short, and was, for the most part, muffled in a hooded garment which swept the ground. The only part of the form which projected from that shelter was not shaped like any hand or arm. Mr. Wraxall compares it to the tentacle of a devilfish, and continues, "On seeing this, I said to myself, This, then, which is evidently an allegorical representation of some kind, a fiend pursuing a hunted soul, may be the origin of the story of Count Magnus and his mysterious companion. Let us see how the huntsman is pictured. Doubtless it will be a demon blowing his horn. But, as it turned out, there was no such sensational figure, only the semblance of a cloaked man on a hillock, who stood leaning on a stick and watching the hunt with an interest which the engraver had tried to express in his attitude. Mr. Wraxall noted the finely worked and massive steel padlocks, 3 in number, which secured the sarcophagus. One of them, he saw, was detached and lay on the pavement. And then, unwilling to delay the deacon longer or to waste his own working time, he made his way onward to the manor house. It is curious, he notes, how on retracing a familiar path one's thoughts engross one to the absolute exclusion of surrounding objects. Tonight, for the second time, I had entirely failed to notice where I was going. I had planned a private visit to the tomb house to copy the epitaphs, when I suddenly, as it were, awoke to consciousness, and found myself, as before, turning in at the churchyard gate, and, I believe, singing or chanting some words such as, "Are you awake, Count Magnus? Are you asleep, Count Magnus?" And then something more which I have failed to recollect. It seemed to me that I must have been behaving in this nonsensical way for some time. I found the key of the mausoleum where I had expected to find it, and copied the greater part of what I wanted. In fact, I stayed until the light began to fail me. I must have been wrong in saying that one of the padlocks of my count's sarcophagus was unfastened. I see tonight that 2 are loose. I picked both up and laid them carefully on the window ledge, after trying unsuccessfully to close them. The remaining one is still firm, and, though I take it to be a spring lock, I cannot guess how it is opened. Had I succeeded in undoing it, I am almost afraid I should have taken the liberty of opening the sarcophagus. It is strange, the interest I feel in the personality of this, I fear, somewhat ferocious and grim old noble. The day following was, as it turned out, the last of Mr. Wraxall's stay at Roebuck. He received letters connected with certain investments which made it desirable that he should return to England. His work among the papers was practically done, and traveling was slow. He decided, therefore, to make his farewells, put some finishing touches to his notes, and be off. These finishing touches and farewells, as it turned out, took more time than he had expected. The hospitable family insisted on his staying to dine with them. They dined at 3, and it was verging on 6:30 before he was outside the iron gates of Roebuck. He dwelt on every step of his walk by the lake, determined to saturate himself, now that he trotted for the last time, in the sentiment of the place and hour. And, when he reached the summit of the churchyard knoll, he lingered for many minutes, gazing at the limitless prospect of woods near and distant, all dark between a sky of liquid green. When at last he turned to go, the thought struck him that surely he must bid farewell to Count Magnus as well as the rest of the De la Gardis. The church was but 20 yards away, and he knew where the key of the mausoleum hung. It was not long before he was standing over the great copper coffin, and, as usual, talking to himself aloud. "You may have been a bit of a rascal in your time, Magnus," he was saying, "but for all that, I should like to see you, or, rather—" Just at that instant, he says, I felt a blow on my foot. Hastily enough, I drew it back, and something fell on the pavement with a clash. It was the third, the last of the 3 padlocks which had fastened the sarcophagus. I stooped to pick it up, and heaven is my witness that I am writing only the bare truth. Before I had raised myself, there was a sound of metal hinges creaking, and I distinctly saw the lid shifting upwards. I may have behaved like a coward, but I could not for my life stay for one moment. I was outside that dreadful building in less time than I can write, almost as quickly as I could have said the words. And what frightens me yet more, I could not turn the key in the lock. As I sit here in my room noting these facts, I ask myself, it was not 20 minutes ago, whether that noise of creaking metal continued, and I cannot tell whether it did or not. I only know that there was something more than I have written that alarmed me, but whether it was sound or sight, I am not able to remember. What is this that I have done? Poor Mr. Wraxall. He set out on his journey to England on the next day, as he had planned, and he reached England in safety. And yet, as I gather from his changed hand and inconsequent jottings, a broken man. One of several small notebooks that have come to me with his papers gives not a key to, but a kind of inkling of his experiences. Much of his journey was made by canal boat, and I find not less than 6 painful attempts to enumerate and describe his fellow passengers. The entries are of this kind: 24, pastor of village in Skane, usual black coat and soft black hat. 25, commercial traveler from Stockholm going to Trollhättan, black cloak, brown hat. 26, man in long black cloak, broad-leafed hat, very old-fashioned. This entry is lined out and a note added, perhaps identical with number 13, have not yet seen his face. On referring to number 13, I find that he is a Roman priest in a cassock. The net result of the reckoning is always the same. 28 people appear in the enumeration, one being always a man in a long black cloak and broad hat, and the other a short figure in dark cloak and hood. On the other hand, it is always noted that only 26 passengers appear at meals, and that the man in the cloak is perhaps absent, and the short figure is certainly absent. On reaching England, it appears that Mr. Wraxall landed at Harwich, and that he resolved at once to put himself out of the reach of some person or persons whom he never specifies, but whom he had evidently come to regard as his pursuers. Accordingly, he took a vehicle, it was a closed fly, not trusting the railway, and drove across country to the village of Belchamp St. Paul. It was about 9 o'clock on a moonlit August night when he neared the place. He was sitting forward and looking out of the window at the fields and thickets. There was little else to be seen, racing past him. Suddenly, he came to a crossroad. At the corner, 2 figures were standing motionless. Both were in dark cloaks. The taller one wore a hat, the shorter a hood. He had no time to see their faces, nor did they make any motion that he could discern. Yet the horse shied violently and broke into a gallop, and Mr. Wraxall sank back into his seat in something like desperation. He had seen them before. Arrived at Belchamp St. Paul, he was fortunate enough to find a decent furnished lodging, and for the next 24 hours he lived, comparatively speaking, in peace. His last notes were written on this day. They are too disjointed and ejaculatory to be given here in full, but the substance of them is clear enough. He is expecting a visit from his pursuers, how or when he knows not, and his constant cry is, "What has he done?" and Is there no hope? Doctors, he knows, would call him mad. Policemen would laugh at him. The parson is away. What can he do but lock his door and cry to God? People still remembered last year at Belchamp St. Paul how a strange gentleman came one evening in August years back, and how the next morning but one he was found dead, and there was an inquest, and the jury that viewed the body fainted. 7 of them did, and none of them wouldn't speak to what they see, and the verdict was visitation of God, and how the people as kept the house moved out the same week and went away from that part. But they do not, I think, know that any glimmer of light has ever been thrown or could be thrown on the mystery. It so happened that last year the little house came into my hands as part of a legacy. It had stood empty since 1863, and there seemed no prospect of letting it, so I had it pulled down, and the papers of which I have given you an abstract were found in a forgotten cupboard under the window in the best bedroom. The Homecoming by Ray Bradbury, 1946. "Here they come," said Cecy, lying there flat in her bed. "Where are they?" cried Timothy from the doorway. "Some of them are over Europe, some over Asia, some of them over the islands, some over South America," said Cecy, her eyes closed, the lashes long, brown, and quivering. Timothy came forward upon the bare plankings of the upstairs room. "Who are they?" "Uncle Einar and Uncle Fry, and there's Cousin William, and I see Frolda and Helgar and Aunt Morgiana and Cousin Vivian, and I see Uncle Johann. They're all coming fast." "Are they up in the sky?" cried Timothy, his little gray eyes flashing. Standing by the bed, he looked no more than his 14 years. The wind blew outside, and the house was dark and lit only by starlight. "They're coming through the air and traveling along the ground in many forms," said Cecy in her sleeping. She did not move on the bed. She thought inward on herself and told what she saw. "I see a wolf-like thing coming up over a dark river at the shallows, just above a waterfall, the starlight shining up his pelt. I see a brown oak leaf blowing far up in the sky. I see a small bat flying. I see many other things running through the forest trees and slipping through the highest branches, and they're all coming this way." "Will they be here by tomorrow night?" Timothy clutched the bedclothes. The spider on his lapel swung like a black pendulum, excitedly dancing. He leaned over his sister. "Will they all be here in time for the homecoming?" Yes, Timothy, yes," sighed Cecy. She stiffened. "Ask no more of me. Go away now. Let me travel in the places I like best." "Thanks, Cecy," he said. Out in the hall, he ran to his room. He hurriedly made his bed. He had just awakened a few minutes ago at sunset, and as the first stars had risen, he had gone to let his excitement about the party run with Cecy. Now she slept so quietly there was not a sound. The spider hung on a silvery lasso around Timothy's slender neck as he washed his face. "Just think, Spide! Tomorrow night is All Hallows Eve." He lifted his face and looked into the mirror. His was the only mirror allowed in the house. It was his mother's concession to his illness. Oh, if only he were not so afflicted. He opened his mouth, surveyed the poor, inadequate teeth nature had given him. No more than so many corn kernels, round, soft, and pale in his jaws. Some of the high spirit died in him. It was now totally dark, and he lit a candle to see by. He felt exhausted. This past week, the whole family had lived in the fashion of the old country, sleeping by day, rousing at sunset to move about. There were blue hollows under his eyes. "Spide, I'm no good," he said quietly to the little creature. "I can't even get used to sleeping days like the others." He took up the candle holder. Oh, to have strong teeth with incisors like steel spikes, or strong hands even, or a strong mind, even to have the power to send one's mind out, free, as Ceci did. But no, he was the imperfect one, the sick one. He was even, he shivered and drew the candle flame closer, afraid of the dark. His brothers snorted at him. Byron and Leonard and Sam, they laughed at him because he slept in a bed. With Ceci, it was different. Her bed was part of her comfort, for the composure necessary to send her mind abroad to hunt. But Timothy, did he sleep in the wonderful polished boxes like the others? He did not. Mother let him have his own bed, his own room, his own mirror. No wonder the family skirted him like a holy man's crucifix. If only the wings would sprout from his shoulder blades. He bared his back, stared at it, and sighed again. No chance. Never. Downstairs were exciting and mysterious sounds, the slithering black crepe going up in all the halls and on the ceilings and doors, the sputter of burning black tapers in the banistered stairwell, Mother's voice high and firm, Father's voice echoing from the damp cellar, Bion walking from outside the old country house, lugging vast 2-gallon jugs. "I've just got to go to the party, Spide," said Timothy. The spider whirled at the end of its silk, and Timothy felt alone. He would polish cases, fetch toadstools and spiders, hang crepe, but when the party started, he'd be ignored. The less seen or said of the imperfect son, the better. All through the house below, Laura ran. "The homecoming!" she shouted gaily. "The homecoming!" Her footsteps everywhere at once. Timothy passed Ceci's room again, and she was sleeping quietly. Once a month she went below stairs. Always she stayed in bed. Lovely Ceci, he felt like asking her, "Where are you now, Ceci? And in who? And what's happening? Are you beyond the hills? And what goes on there?" But he went on to Ellen's room instead. Ellen sat at her desk, sorting out many kinds of blonde, red, and black hair, and little scimitars of fingernails gathered from her manicurist job at the Mellon Village beauty parlor 15 miles over. A sturdy mahogany case lay in one corner with her name on it. "Go away," she said, not even looking at him. "I can't work with you gawking." "All Hallows Eve, Ellen! Just think," he said, trying to be friendly. "Huh." She put some fingernail clippings in a small white sack, labeled them. "What can it mean to you? What do you know of it? It'll scare hell out of you. Go back to bed." His cheeks burned. "I'm needed to polish and work and help serve. "If you don't go, you'll find a dozen raw oysters in your bed tomorrow," said Ellen matter-of-factly. "Goodbye, Timothy." In his anger, rushing downstairs, he bumped into Laura. "Watch where you're going," she shrieked from clenched teeth. She swept away. He ran to the open cellar door, smelled the channel of moist, earthy air rising from below. "Father?" "It's about time," Father shouted up the steps. "Hurry down, or they'll be here before we're ready." Timothy hesitated only long enough to hear the million other sounds in the house. Brothers came and went like trains in a station, talking and arguing. If you stood in one spot long enough, the entire household passed with their pale hands full of things. Leonard with his little black medical case, Samuel with his large, dusty, ebony-bound book under his arm, bearing more black crepe, and Bion excursioning to the car outside and bringing in many more gallons of liquid. Father stopped polishing to give Timothy a rag and a scowl. He thumped the huge mahogany box. "Come on, shine this up so we can start on another. Sleep your life away." While waxing the surface, Timothy looked inside. "Uncle Einer's a big man, isn't he, Papa?" "Mm-hmm." "How big is he?" "The size of the box'll tell you." "I was only asking." 7 feet tall?" "You talk a lot." About 9 o'clock, Timothy went out into the October weather. For 2 hours in the now warm, now cold wind, he walked the meadows collecting toadstools and spiders. His heart began to beat with anticipation again. How many relatives had Mother said would come? 70? 100? He passed a farmhouse. "If only you knew what was happening at our house," he said to the glowing windows. He climbed a hill and looked at the town, miles away, settling into sleep. The town hall clock high and round, white in the distance. The town did not know either. He brought home many jars of toadstools and spiders. In the little chapel below stairs, a brief ceremony was celebrated. It was like all the other rituals over the years, with Father chanting the dark lines, Mother's beautiful white ivory hands moving in the reverse blessings, and all the children gathered except Ceci, who lay upstairs in bed. But Ceci was present. You saw her peering, now from Bion's eyes, now Samuel's, now Mother's, and you felt a movement, and now she was in you, fleetingly, and gone. Timothy prayed to the Dark One with a tightened stomach. "Please, please, help me grow up. Help me be like my sisters and brothers. Don't let me be different. If only I could put the hair in the plastic images as Ellen does, or make people fall in love with me as Laura does with people, or read strange books as Sam does, or work in a respected job like Leonard and Bion do, or even raise a family one day as Mother and Father have done." At midnight, a storm hammered the house. Lightning struck outside in amazing snow-white bolts. There was the sound of an approaching, probing, sucking tornado, funneling and nuzzling the moist night earth. Then the front door, blasted half off its hinges, hung stiff and discarded, and in trooped Grandmama and Grandpapa, all the way from the old country. From then on, people arrived each hour. There was a flutter at the side window, a rap on the front door, a knock at the back. There were fey noises from the cellar. Autumn wind piped down the chimney throat, chanting. Mother filled the large crystal punch bowl with the scarlet liquid poured from the jugs Bion had carried home. Father swept from room to room, lighting more tapers. Laura and Ellen hammered up more wolfsbane. And Timothy stood amidst this wild excitement, no expression to his face, his hands trembling at his sides, gazing now here, now there. Banging of doors, laughter, the sound of liquid pouring, darkness, sound of wind, the webbed thunder of wings, the padding of feet, the welcoming bursts of talk at the entrances, the transparent rattling of casements, the shadows passing, coming, going, wavering.
Well, well, and this must be Timothy.
What? A chilly hand took his hand. A long, hairy face leaned down over him.
A good lad, a fine lad,
said the stranger. Timothy, said his mother, this is Uncle Jason. Hello, Uncle Jason. And over here, Mother drifted Uncle Jason away. Uncle Jason peered back at Timothy over his caped shoulder and winked. Timothy stood alone. From off 1,000 miles in the candled darkness, he heard a high fluting voice. That was Ellen. And my brothers, they are clever. Can you guess their occupations, Aunt Morgiana? I have no idea. They operate the undertaking establishment in town.
What?
A gasp. Yes, shrill laughter. Isn't that priceless? Timothy stood very still. A pause in the laughter. They bring home sustenance for Mama, Papa, and all of us, said Laura. Except, of course, Timothy. An uneasy silence. Uncle Jason's voice demanded,
Well, come now. What about Timothy?
Oh, Laura, your tongue, said Mother. Laura went on with it. Timothy shut his eyes. Timothy doesn't like blood. He's delicate. He'll learn, said Mother. He'll learn, she said very firmly. He's my son, and he'll learn. He's only 14.
But I was raised on the stuff,
said Uncle Jason, his voice passing from one room on into another. The wind played the trees outside like harps. A little rain spattered on the windows.
Raised on the stuff,
passing away into faintness. Timothy bit his lips and opened his eyes. Well, it was all my fault. Mother was showing them into the kitchen now. I tried forcing him. You can't force children. You only make them sick, and then they never get a taste for things. Look at Bion now. He was 13 before he...
I understand, murmured Uncle Jason. Timothy will come around.
I'm sure he will, said Mother defiantly. Candle flames quivered as shadows crossed and recrossed the dozen musty rooms. Timothy was cold. He smelled the hot tallow in his nostrils, and instinctively he grabbed at a candle and walked with it around and about the house, pretending to straighten the crepe. Timothy! Someone whispered behind a patterned wall, hissing and sizzling and sighing the words. Timothy is afraid of the dark. Leonard's voice. Hateful Leonard. I like the candle, that's all, said Timothy in a reproachful whisper. More lightning, more thunder, cascades of roaring laughter, bangings and clickings and shouts and rustles of clothing. Clammy fog swept through the front door. Out of the fog, settling his wings, stalked a tall man. Uncle Einar! Timothy propelled himself on his thin legs straight through the fog, under the green webbing shadows. He threw himself across Einar's arms. Einar lifted him. You wings, Timothy! He tossed the boy light as thistles. Wings, Timothy! Fly! Faces wheeled under. Darkness rotated. The house blew away. Timothy felt breeze-like. He flapped his arms. Einar's fingers caught and threw him once more to the ceiling. The ceiling rushed down like a charred wall. "Fly, Timothy!" shouted Einar, loud and deep. "Fly with wings! Wings!" He felt an exquisite ecstasy in his shoulder blades, as if roots grew, burst to explode and blossom into new, moist membrane. He babbled wild stuff. Again Einar hurled him high. The autumn wind broke in a tide on the house. Rain crashed down, shaking the beams, causing chandeliers to tilt their enraged candle lights. And the 100 relatives peered out from every black, enchanted room, circling inward, all shapes and sizes, to where Einar balanced the child like a baton in the roaring spaces. "Enough!" shouted Einar at last. Timothy, deposited on the floor timbers, exhaustedly fell against Uncle Einar, sobbing happily, "Uncle, uncle, uncle!" "Was it good, flying? Eh, Timothy?" said Uncle Einar, bending down, patting Timothy's head. "Good, good." It was coming toward dawn. Most had arrived and were ready to bed down for the daylight, sleep motionlessly with no sound until the following sunset, when they would shout out of their mahogany boxes for the revelry. Uncle Einar, followed by dozens of others, moved toward the cellar. Mother directed them downward to the crowded row on row of highly polished boxes. Einar, his wings like sea-green tarpaulins tented behind him, moved with a curious whistling down the passageway. Where his wings touched, they made a sound of drum heads gently beaten. Upstairs, Timothy lay wearily thinking, trying to like the darkness. There was so much you could do in darkness that people couldn't criticize you for, because they never saw you. He did like the night, but it was a qualified liking. Sometimes there was so much night, he cried out in rebellion. And the cellar, mahogany doors sealed downward, drawn in by pale hands. In corners, certain relatives circled 3 times to lie, heads on paws, eyelids shut. The sun rose. There was a sleeping. Sunset. The revel exploded like a bat nest struck full, shrieking out, fluttering, spreading. Box doors banged wide. Steps rushed up from cellar damp. More late guests, kicking on front and back portals, were admitted. It rained, and sodden visitors laid their capes, their water-pelleted hats, their sprinkled veils upon Timothy, who bore them to a closet. The rooms were crowd-packed. The laughter of one cousin, shot from one room, angled off the wall of another, ricocheted, banked, and returned to Timothy's ears from a 4th room, accurate and cynical. A mouse ran across the floor. "I know you, niece Lieberschratter," exclaimed father. The mouse spiraled 3 women's feet and vanished into a corner. Moments later, a beautiful woman rose up out of nothing and stood in the corner, smiling her white smile at them all. Something huddled against the flooded pane of the kitchen window. It sighed and wept and tapped continually, pressed against the glass. But Timothy could make nothing of it. He saw nothing. In imagination, he was outside staring in. The rain was on him, the wind at him, and the taper-dotted darkness inside was inviting. Waltzes were being danced, tall, thin figures pirouetted to outlandish music. Stars of light flickered off lifted bottles. Small clods of earth crumbled from casks, and a spider fell and went silently legging over the floor. Timothy shivered. He was inside the house again. Mother was calling him to run here, run there, help, serve, out to the kitchen now, fetch this, fetch that, bring the plates, heap the food, on and on. The party happened around him, but not to him. The dozens of towering people pressed in against him, elbowed him, ignored him. Finally, he turned and slipped away up the stairs. He called softly, "Ceci, where are you now, Ceci?" She waited a long time before answering. "In the Imperial Valley," she murmured faintly, "beside the Salton Sea, near the mud pots and the steam and the quiet. I'm inside a farmer's wife. I'm sitting on a front porch. I can make her move if I want, or do anything, or think anything. The sun's going down. What's it like, Ceci?" "You can hear the mud pots hissing," she said slowly, as if speaking in a church. "Little gray heads of steam push up the mud like bald men rising in the thick syrup, head first out in the boiling channels. The gray heads rip like rubber fabric, collapse with noises like wet lips moving, and feathery plumes of steam escape from the ripped tissue. And there is the smell of deep, sulphurous burning and old times. The dinosaur has been a-broiling here 10 million years. Is he done yet, Ceci?" "Yes, he's done. Quite done." Ceci's calm sleeper's lips turned up. The languid words fell slowly from her shaping mouth. "Inside this woman's skull I am, looking out, watching the sea that does not move, and is so quiet it makes you afraid. I sit on the porch and wait for my husband to come home. Occasionally, a fish leaps, falls back, starlight edging it. The valley, the sea, the few cars, the wooden porch, my rocking chair, myself, the silence. What now, Ceci?" "I'm getting up from my rocking chair," she said. "I'm walking off the porch toward the mud pots. Planes fly over like primordial birds. Then it is quiet, so quiet." "How long will you stay inside her, Ceci?" "Until I've listened and looked and felt enough. Until I've changed her life some way. I'm walking off the porch and along the wooden boards. My feet knock on the planks, tiredly, slowly. And now? Now the sulfur fumes are all around me. I stare at the bubbles as they break and smooth. A bird darts by my temple, shrieking. Suddenly, I am in the bird and fly away. And as I fly, inside my new small glass bead eyes, I see a woman below me on a boardwalk take 1, 2, 3 steps forward into the mud pots. I hear a sound as of a boulder plunged into molten depths. I keep flying, circle back. I see a white hand, like a spider, wriggle and disappear into the gray lava pool. The lava seals over. Now I'm flying home, swift, swift, swift. Something clapped hard against the window. Timothy started. Cecy flicked her eyes wide, bright, full, happy, exhilarated. "Now I'm home," she said. After a pause, Timothy ventured, "The homecoming's on, and everybody's here." "Then why are you upstairs?" She took his hand. "Well, ask me," she smiled slyly. "Ask me what you came to ask." "I didn't come to ask anything," he said. "Well, almost nothing. Well, oh, Cecy," it came from him in one long, rapid flow. "I want to do something at the party to make them look at me, something to make me good as them, something to make me belong, but there's nothing I can do, and I feel funny, and, well, I thought you might." "I might," she said, closing her eyes, smiling inwardly. "Stand up straight, stand very still." He obeyed. "Now, shut your eyes and blank out your thought." He stood very straight and thought of nothing, or at least thought of thinking nothing. She sighed. "Shall we go downstairs now, Timothy?" Like a hand into a glove, Cecy was within him. "Look, everybody!" Timothy held the glass of warm red liquid. He held up the glass so that the whole house turned to watch him. Aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters. He drank it straight down. He jerked a hand at his sister, Laura. He held her gaze, whispering to her in a subtle voice that kept her silent, frozen. He felt tall as the trees as he walked to her. The party now slowed. It waited on all sides of him, watching. From all the room doors the faces peered. They were not laughing. Mother's face was astonished. Dad looked bewildered, but pleased and getting prouder every instant. He nipped Laura gently over the neck vein. The candle flame swayed drunkenly. The wind climbed around on the roof outside. The relatives stared from all the doors. He popped toadstools into his mouth, swallowed, then beat his arms against his flanks and circled. "Look, Uncle Einar! Jean fly at last!" Beat went his hands. Up and down pumped his feet. The faces flashed past him. At the top of the stairs, flapping, he heard his mother cry, "Stop, Timothy!" Far below. "Hey!" shouted Timothy, and leaped off the top of the well, thrashing. Halfway down, the wings he thought he owned dissolved. He screamed. Uncle Einar caught him. Timothy flailed whitely in the receiving arms. A voice burst out of his lips, unbidden. "This is Cecy! This is Cecy! Come see me, all of you, upstairs, first room on the left!" Followed by a long trill of high laughter. Timothy tried to cut it off with his tongue. Everybody was laughing. Einar set him down, running through the crowding blackness as the relatives flowed upstairs towards Cecy's room to congratulate her. Timothy banged the front door open. "Cecy, I hate you! I hate you!" By the sycamore tree, in deep shadow, Timothy spewed out his dinner, sobbed bitterly, and thrashed in a pile of autumn leaves. Then he lay still. From his blouse pocket, from the protection of the matchbox he used for his retreat, the spider crawled forth. Spide walked along Timothy's arm. Spide explored up his neck to his ear and climbed in the ear to tickle it. Timothy shook his head. "Don't, Spide, don't!" The feathery touch of a tentative feeler probing his eardrum set Timothy shivering. "Don't, Spide!" He sobbed somewhat less. The spider traveled down his cheek, took a station under the boy's nose, looked up into the nostrils as if to seek the brain, and then clambered softly up over the rim of the nose to sit, to squat there peering at Timothy with green gem eyes, until Timothy filled with ridiculous laughter. "Go away, Spide!" Timothy sat up, rustling the leaves. The land was very bright with the moon. In the house, He could hear the faint ribaldry as Mirror, Mirror was played. Celebrants shouted, dimly muffled, as they tried to identify those of themselves whose reflections had not ever appeared in a glass. "Timothy?" Uncle Einar's wings spread and twitched, and came in with a sound like kettle drums. Timothy felt himself plucked up like a thimble and set upon Einar's shoulder. "Don't feel badly, nephew Timothy. Each to his own, each in his own way. How much better things are for you. How rich. The world's dead for us. We've seen so much of it, believe me. Life's best to those who live the least of it. It's worth more per ounce, Timothy. Remember that." The rest of the black morning, from midnight on, Uncle Einar led him about the house, from room to room, weaving and singing. A horde of late arrivals set the entire hilarity off afresh. Great, and 1,000 more great-greats grandmother was there, wrapped in Egyptian cerements. She said not a word, but lay straight as a burnt ironing board against the wall, her eye hollows cupping a distant, wise, silent glimmering. At the breakfast, at 4 a.m, 1,000-odd greats grandmamma was stiffly seated at the head of the longest table. The numerous young cousins caroused at the crystal punch bowl. Their shiny olive pit eyes, their conical, devilish faces, and curly bronze hair hovered over the drinking table, their hard, soft, half-girl, half-boy bodies wrestling against each other as they got unpleasantly, sullenly drunk. The wind got higher, the stars burned with fiery intensity, the noises redoubled, the dances quickened, the drinking became more positive. To Timothy, there were thousands of things to hear and watch. The many darknesses roiled, bubbled, the many faces passed and repassed. Listen! The party held its breath. Far away, the town clock struck its chimes, saying 6 o'clock. The party was ending. In time, to the rhythm of the striking clock, their 100 voices began to sing songs that were 400 years old, songs Timothy could not know. Arms twined, circling slowly, they sang, and somewhere in the cold distance of morning, the town clock finished out its chimes and quieted. Timothy sang. He knew no words, no tune, yet the words and tune came round and high and good. And he gazed at the closed door at the top of the stairs. "Thanks, Ceci," he whispered. "You're forgiven. Thanks." Then he just relaxed and let the words move, with Ceci's voice free from his lips. Goodbyes were said. There was a great rustling. Mother and father stood at the door to shake hands and kiss each departing relative in turn. The sky beyond the open door colored in the east. A cold wind entered, and Timothy felt himself seized and settled in one body after another, felt Ceci press him into Uncle Fry's head so he stared from the wrinkled leather face, then leaped into a flurry of leaves up over the house and awakening hills. Then, loping down a dirt path, he felt his red eyes burning, his fur pelt rhymed with morning, as inside Cousin William he panted through a hollow and dissolved away. Like a pebble in Uncle Einar's mouth, Timothy flew in a webbed thunder, filling the sky. And then he was back, for all time, in his own body. In the growing dawn, the last few were embracing and crying and thinking how the world was becoming less a place for them. There had been a time when they had met every year, but now decades passed with no reconciliation. "Don't forget," someone cried, "we meet in Salem in 1970. Salem. Timothy's numbed mind turned the words over. Salem. 1970. And there would be Uncle Fry and 1,000 times great-grandmother in her withered cerements, and mother and father and Ellen and Laura and Ceci and all the rest. But would he be there? Could he be certain of staying alive until then? With one last withering blast, away they all went. So many scarves, so many fluttery mammals, so many serene leaves, so many whining and clustering noises, so many midnights and insanities and dreams. Mother shut the door. Laura picked up a broom. "No," said Mother, "we'll clean tonight. Now we need sleep." And the family vanished down cellar and upstairs. And Timothy moved in the crepe-littered hall, his head down. Passing a party mirror, he saw the pale mortality of his face, all cold and trembling. "Timothy," said Mother. She came to touch her hand on his face. "Son," she said, "we love you. Remember that. We all love you. No matter how different you are, no matter if you leave us one day." She kissed his cheek. "And if and when you die, your bones will lie undisturbed. We'll see to that. You'll lie at ease forever, and I'll come visit every All Hallows Eve and tuck you in the more secure." The house was silent. Far away the wind went over a hill with its last cargo of dark bats, echoing, chittering. Timothy walked up the steps, one by one, crying to himself all the way.
To die, to be really dead, that must be glorious.
Why, Count Dracula.
There are far worse things, waiting man, than death.